In the vast expanse of space, humans had always been labeled as the cowards of the galaxy. The other species, with their impressive natural weapons and enhanced abilities, looked down upon our soft skin, our need for protective gear, and our tendency to solve problems through discussion rather than combat. But they never understood that true courage isn't about rushing headlong into danger. It's about standing up for what's right, even when every instinct screams at you to run. I remember the day everything changed. I was working as a diplomatic liaison on Station 7, one of the busiest trading hubs in the Orion Arm. The station housed representatives from 27 different species, each more physically imposing than the last. The Kravthak, with their crystalline exoskeletons. The Meridians, who could regenerate entire limbs in minutes. The Voss, whose neural networks allowed them to process information 1,000 times faster than any human brain. And then there was me, Sarah Chen, 5 feet 6 inches of apparently disappointing human existence. I lost count of how many times the other species would whisper fragile or primitive when they thought I couldn't hear them. But my grandmother used to say that being underestimated was sometimes the greatest advantage you could have. That advantage proved invaluable when the Unified Council announced their decision to reorganize the refugee crisis from the Centauri conflict. Their solution: to relocate millions of displaced civilians to harsh mining colonies, where they would earn their keep. The council chambers erupted in approving roars. After all, it was the logical solution. The strong survive, the weak serve. That was the way of the galaxy. But logic without compassion isn't wisdom. It's just cruelty wearing a suit of rationality. I watched as the other diplomats nodded along, their advanced minds calculating the benefits, their enhanced bodies relaxed in their seats. None of them seemed bothered by the fact that they were condemning children, elderly, and injured to what amounted to slave labor. After all, it wasn't their people at risk. The refugees were mostly from lesser species. My hands were shaking as I stood up. I'm not ashamed to admit I was terrified. In a room full of beings who could tear me apart without breaking a sweat, I was about to do something incredibly stupid, or incredibly brave. Sometimes the line between the two is razor thin. I object, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. And I moved to invoke Article 7 of the Galactic Charter, the right to challenge a council decision through demonstration of alternative solutions. The chamber went silent, the kind of silence that feels like a physical weight on your chest. I could feel their eyes on me, compound eyes, crystalline sensors, neural scanners, all focused on the soft, weak human who dared to stand against the consensus. The council leader, a towering Voss named High Commander Vexthor, leaned forward on his platform. His neural crystals pulsed with what I recognized as amusement. And how, his synthesized voice echoed through the chamber, does a species that barely managed to leave its own solar system propose to solve a crisis that our combined intellects have analyzed for months? I took a deep breath, knowing my next words would either change everything or end my diplomatic career, possibly along with my life. Because, High Commander, while you've been analyzing numbers, we humans have been doing something far more important. We've been listening to stories, and I have one hell of a story to tell you about how humanity handled its own refugee crisis 200 years ago. I just had to hope they would give me the chance to finish it. The council chamber remained silent as I brought up the holographic display. With steady hands, steadier than I felt inside, I projected images of Earth's past. Not the gleaming cities we had now, but the crowded refugee camps and makeshift shelters from the climate wars of the 2100s. 200 years ago, humanity faced its own extinction-level crisis. I continued, watching the alien faces for any sign of interest or understanding. Rising seas had swallowed coastal cities whole. Millions were displaced. Resources were scarce. By your logic, by the mathematics of survival, we should have left the weak to perish. High Commander Vexthor's neural crystals flickered with what might have been curiosity. And yet you didn't. A decision that cost your species decades of progress and resources. His tone made it clear this was precisely why humans were considered foolish by galactic standards. Progress. I let out a small laugh, earning shocked looks from several diplomats. Laughing at a high commander was considered somewhere between suicide and sacrilege. Let me show you what real progress looks like. I switched the display to show the refugee integration centers, the community farms, the educational programs. We didn't just shelter people, we invested in them. Every refugee was given the chance to learn, to contribute, to rebuild, not as slaves, but as equals. Those displaced fishermen, they became the architects of our first underwater cities, the farmers who lost their lands. They pioneered vertical agriculture techniques we still use today. A Meridian representative rose from her seat, her iridescent scales shimmering with skepticism. Pretty words, human diplomat chin, but you cannot deny the economic burden. Your own historical records show a significant downturn during this period. For 12 years, I acknowledged. But what came after? I switched to the final set of images, the flourishing underwater metropolises, the vertical farm towers that helped end global hunger, the cultural renaissance that brought humanity closer than ever before. When you invest in people, you invest in innovation, in creativity, in solutions you couldn't possibly imagine because they come from perspectives you never considered. The chamber buzzed with quiet discussions. I could see the calculations running behind their enhanced eyes, the cost-benefit analyses their superior minds were processing. But they were still missing the point. But that's not even why we did it, I said, my voice softening. We did it because it was right, because every time in human history when we've chosen cruelty over compassion, chosen efficiency over empathy, we've ended up on the wrong side of history. You call us cowards because we feel fear, because we hesitate before violence, because we rather talk than fight. But let me ask you something. What's more cowardly? Admitting your fears and acting anyway, or being so afraid of appearing weak that you'd sacrifice millions of innocent lives just to maintain an image of strength? The chamber erupted in outraged hisses and growls. I'd struck a nerve, several actually. High Commander Vexthor rose to his full height, his neural crystals now pulsing an angry red. You dare accuse the Council of cowardice? No, I replied, meeting his gaze steadily. I'm offering you a chance to be truly brave, to admit that maybe, just maybe, the species you've dismissed as primitive might have something to teach you about courage, about strength, about what it truly means to be civilized. The High Commander's hand moved to the ceremonial blade at his waist, a gesture that had ended many diplomatic careers and several diplomatic lives. You have exactly 1 minute, human diplomat Chen, to explain precisely how you propose to handle these refugees, and if your solution involves any more lectures about human morality. He left the threat hanging, but I didn't need him to finish it. I had 1 minute to either save millions of lives or become an object lesson in why humans shouldn't challenge their betters. Good thing we humans work well under pressure. 1 minute, I nodded, keeping my voice steady despite the tension crackling through the chamber. That's actually perfect, because I need exactly 1 minute to show you something that will change everything. I pulled out a small holoprojector from my pocket. A risky move, given how many weapons could be concealed in such a device, but I noticed none of the security drones moved to stop me. Even they, with their advanced AI, were probably calculating that a human couldn't possibly pose a real threat. The center of the chamber filled with a new hologram, a vast, detailed map of supposedly uninhabitable systems within Council space. Dozens of points lit up in brilliant blue, each representing something that made several Council members shift uncomfortably in their seats. These are the systems your surveys marked as unable to sustain life over the last 50 years, I said, watching understanding dawn in their enhanced eyes. Except humans have a rather different definition of uninhabitable than most species. Where you see hostile environments, we see opportunities, places that, with a little human ingenuity and a lot of hard work, could become homes. The Kravthak ambassador's crystalline form trembled with what might have been anger or excitement. It was always hard to tell with their species. You cannot be suggesting. I am, I interrupted, knowing I was breaking about a dozen diplomatic protocols. Every blue point on this map represents a system where human environmental engineering could establish viable colonies within 2 years. Not luxury resorts, not paradise worlds, but places where people could live with dignity, work for their future, and most importantly, contribute to the Council's economy rather than drain it. High Commander Vexthor's neural crystals pulsed rapidly as he processed the data. Your species would take responsibility for this. You would stake your reputation, your very position in the Council, on such an ambitious plan. We would, I said, then corrected myself. We will. Because that's what humans do. We adapt. We overcome. We turn hostile environments into homes. It's not just what we do, it's who we are. The chamber erupted in overlapping conversations, calculations, and arguments. I could see the battle playing out across their faces, their logical minds processing the potential benefits while their pride wrestled with accepting help from lesser beings. Then, from the back of the chamber, a small voice spoke up, a young Centauri refugee who had somehow slipped into the public observation area, her bioluminescent markings dim with exhaustion and fear. My family, she started, her translator struggling with her emotional state. We don't need paradise. We just need a chance. The chamber fell silent again, but this silence was different from before. This wasn't the silence of shock or outrage. It was the silence of possibility, the silence of change. High Commander Vexthor turned his penetrating gaze from the refugee to me, then back to the glowing map. His hand still rested on his ceremonial blade, but his neural crystals had shifted to a color I'd never seen before. You understand, he said slowly, that if we agree to this and you fail, the consequences will be severe. I squared my shoulders, feeling the weight of millions of lives in my next words. And you understand, High Commander, that if you don't agree to this, the consequences for those refugees, and for the Council's soul, will be far worse. The High Commander's crystals pulsed one final time as he raised his hand to deliver the Council's judgment. In that moment, I realized that sometimes the bravest thing isn't standing up to your enemies. It's standing up to those who think they're doing the right thing for all the wrong reasons. The fate of millions hung on his next words, and I found myself holding my breath along with everyone else in the chamber. High Commander Vexthor's hand remained suspended in the air, but before he could deliver his judgment, the chamber's emergency lights flashed crimson. The massive display screens that lined the walls suddenly flickered to life, showing scenes that made my blood run cold. The refugee camps in the Centauri sector were under attack. Pirate raiders, someone shouted, but I knew better. The ships attacking the camps bore no markings, but their formation was too precise, their timing too perfect. This was no random act of violence. This was a calculated move to eliminate the refugee problem before the Council could make its decision. The chamber erupted into chaos. Representatives argued over military response protocols, while others demanded investigations into how the attackers had breached the sector's defenses. But I couldn't tear my eyes away from the screens, where families, children, were running from precise weapons fire that somehow managed to destroy shelters while leaving valuable resources untouched. How convenient, I said, my voice cutting through the chaos. The words tasted like ashes in my mouth. The very problem we're debating suddenly solves itself. I wonder who could have orchestrated such a precise operation. The chamber fell silent as the implications of my words sank in. I was accusing someone in this very room of attempted genocide. My hands were shaking again, but this time not from fear, from rage. High Commander Vexthor's neural crystals had shifted to a deep purple. Human diplomat Chen, you are treading on very dangerous ground. Such accusations are backed by evidence. I interrupted, manipulating my holoprojector again. You see, humans haven't just been studying those uninhabitable systems. We've been watching, recording, gathering data, and the attack pattern we're seeing right now. It matches classified Council Emergency Protocol 7 Alpha, a protocol only accessible to members of the High Command. The chamber erupted again, but differently this time. Species that had been ready to dismiss us moments ago were now looking at their leaders with new eyes. The Meridian representative's scales had turned a pale shade of horror. The Krafthak ambassador's crystalline form had clouded over with doubt. What you are suggesting, High Commander Vexthor said, his voice dangerous and low, is that members of this council would deliberately. I'm not suggesting anything. I cut in, knowing I was breaking every rule of diplomacy. I'm showing you proof and offering you a choice. I expanded the hologram, showing not just the attacks, but also the fleet of human ships that had been quietly stationed at the edge of the sector. Ships that had been labeled as research vessels, but were, in reality, fully equipped rescue cruisers. You see, while we've been talking about helping refugees, we've also been preparing to actually do it. Those ships can evacuate every refugee in the sector within 6 hours. The only question is, I look directly at the High Commander. Will they be evacuating them with the Council's blessing? Or will humanity be forced to act alone? Because let me be clear, we will act. The only choice you have now is whether you want to be remembered as the Council that authorized a genocide, or the Council that finally learned what real courage looks like. The chamber held its breath as the High Commander's neural crystals cycled through colors faster than I'd ever seen. On the screens above us, the attacks continued, and I could see the moment approaching when I would have to give the evacuation order, with or without permission. Sometimes being brave means being willing to lose everything to do what's right. I just hoped humanity was ready for the consequences if I had just started an interstellar diplomatic crisis. The High Commander's hand moved again, but this time not toward his ceremonial blade. High Commander Vexthor's hand moved to his neural interface, initiating an emergency override of the chamber's security protocols. For a moment, I thought this was it. I'd finally pushed too far, and he was going to have me arrested or worse. Instead, every screen in the chamber suddenly displayed classified files, decades of hidden communications, secret orders, and buried reports. It seems, he said, his synthesized voice carrying an emotion I'd never heard from him before. Regret that human diplomat Chen is not the only one who has been gathering evidence. The chamber watched in stunned silence as he revealed the truth. He had been building a case against corrupt council members for years, watching as they orchestrated crises to profit from the suffering of others. The refugee crisis, the conveniently uninhabitable systems, the sudden pirate attacks, all part of an elaborate scheme to seize resource-rich territories while displacing undesirable populations. I needed proof of an alternative, he said, turning to face me. I needed someone willing to stand up, to risk everything, to show that there was another way. I needed a coward. The way he said that last word, it wasn't an insult anymore. It was almost like a badge of honor. Authorization granted, he announced, his neural crystals blazing with a brilliant white light, for both the evacuation and the arrests. The chamber's doors slid open, revealing squads of council security forces, but they weren't moving to arrest me. They were moving to detain several high-ranking council members who had suddenly tried to flee, including, I noticed with grim satisfaction, the ones whose sectors had the most uninhabitable systems under their control. The human rescue ships are already moving, I reported, watching the tactical displays. We'll have the refugees safe within 4 hours. Then I turned to the High Commander. You knew all along what I would do, what humanity would do. You counted on our cowardice. I counted on your courage, he corrected. The courage to feel fear and act anyway. The courage to risk everything to save others. The courage to be seen as weak in order to do what is right. His neural crystals shifted to a color I'd never seen before, one that my translator identified as hope. But even as the rescue operations began and the corrupt council members were led away, a final alert flashed across the screens. The attacks on the refugee camps had triggered something, a fail-safe protocol buried so deep even the High Commander hadn't known about it. Automated defense systems across the sector were activating, targeting not just the camps, but any ships attempting evacuation. They're going to try to kill everyone, I realized, both to eliminate witnesses and to make sure humans look like failures. The High Commander's crystals pulse with determination. Then we will prove them wrong. Together, he turned to address the chamber. All species with combat-capable ships in the sector, coordinate with the human rescue fleet. Show them what real courage looks like. As the chamber mobilized for an emergency rescue operation, I couldn't help but smile. They'd called us cowards because we chose to fear, to doubt, to question. But in the end, that very cowardice had given us the wisdom to prepare, the empathy to act, and the courage to stand up when it mattered most. The real test wasn't over yet, but for the first time in galactic history, humans weren't facing it alone. And that, perhaps, was the greatest victory of all. The next 12 hours became known in galactic history as the Night of 1,000 Ships. Species that had sneered at each other for centuries suddenly found themselves fighting side by side. Craft-that crystal ships formed living shields around human rescue vessels. Meridian pilots, with their enhanced reflexes, flew interference against the automated defense systems. Even the Voss, usually so logical and removed, linked their neural networks to help coordinate the massive evacuation effort. I watched from the command center as High Commander Vexthor orchestrated the operation with a precision that would have been impossible without the combined strengths of every species involved. The automated defenses were formidable, but they hadn't been programmed to handle such unprecedented cooperation. One by one, the refugee camps were evacuated, with human ships leading the way to those uninhabitable systems that would soon become new homes. The casualty reports came in, miraculously low, thanks to the combined effort, but each loss still hit hard, reminding us of the price of both corruption and courage. The High Commander insisted on personally recording the name of every being lost in the operation, both civilian and rescuer. "So we never forget," he said, "what happens when we let fear of appearing weak prevent us from doing what is right." 3 months later, I stood on the surface of New Hope Colony, one of those supposedly uninhabitable worlds. Around me, reformed atmospheric processors, designed by human engineers and powered by craft-that crystals, turned the harsh environment into something breathable. Meridian biotechnology accelerated plant growth in the soil, while Voss neural networks monitored every aspect of the terraforming process. But the real miracle wasn't the technology. It was watching children from a dozen different species playing together in the newly established park, their parents working side by side in the community centers, their differences forgotten in the shared task of building something new. "You know," High Commander Vexthor said, joining me at the observation point, his neural crystals glowing with what I now recognized as contentment, "there was a moment in that chamber when I truly thought you would fail, when I thought my faith in human cowardice had been misplaced." I smiled, watching a young centauri teaching a human child how to safely create bioluminescent patterns in the evening air. "That's the thing about humans," I said. "We're absolutely terrified of failing. That's why we always have a backup plan, and a backup for the backup." "And that," he replied, "is why you were exactly what the galaxy needed. A species brave enough to be afraid, wise enough to prepare for the worst, and compassionate enough to act anyway." The sun was setting on New Hope Colony, casting long shadows across the growing settlement. In the distance, more ships were arriving, not with refugees this time, but with traders, teachers, artists, and others drawn to this unprecedented experiment in interspecies cooperation. The Council had changed, too. New laws were passed, ensuring nothing like the refugee crisis could ever happen again. But more importantly, a new understanding had emerged. Strength wasn't about being fearless or infallible. True strength, true courage, came from acknowledging your fears and limitations and reaching out to others to overcome them together. As I prepared to leave for my next diplomatic assignment, I took one last look at the colony, a place that existed because humans had been cowardly enough to plan for the worst, brave enough to act when needed, and wise enough to know we couldn't do it alone. Sometimes the greatest acts of courage don't look like courage at all. Sometimes they look like a worried diplomat standing up in a room full of beings who could destroy her. Sometimes they look like asking for help, admitting fear, or choosing compassion over convenience. And sometimes, just sometimes, they change the galaxy forever. The end